When do you need a land surveyor for a site plan? That's a really important question. We see at Redefined Horizons, we see a lot of site plans that are prepared by non-surveyors. Sometimes that's okay. There are a few circumstances when that's all right, but a lot of times it causes problems. I had an amateur land developer call me last week. She's trying to put some apartments on a parcel she had in Modesto, California, and she basically was in construction under a building permit, was ready to pour concrete, and she couldn't do that because she wasn't able to verify that her forms for the foundations met setback. And essentially the root cause of the problem was her permit was issued based on a site plan that didn't have a survey as the foundation. So the company that drafted the site plan just put it together based off the assessor's parcel, and this lady is in construction, contractor's ready to pour concrete. She doesn't even know if her improvements are going to fit on the site as laid out on the site plan. So we see that stuff a lot. And so I want to talk about, when do you need a survey for a site plan? Because you don't always need to. And I tell people surveys are expensive. So you don't want to pay for a boundary survey if you don't need one. And I don't want to sell people surveys that they don't need. There's nothing worse than working for a client that feels like he's having to pay because he has to and he doesn't understand the value that you bring. So what I want to do is I want to explain real briefly what is a site plan, when might you need a site plan, and then talk about when does your site plan need to be based on a survey. We're going to talk about some situations when I don't think you need to have a survey for a site plan, and then there's another broader category of situations in which it's a really good idea to get a survey for a site plan. And you don't have to get a survey for a site plan unless you're forced to by the local agency, your city or county. But there are circumstances when you really should, even if you're not going to be required to. And so I want to talk about why might you want to get a survey for your site plan even if the local agency isn't going to require it. So let's start real quick with a definition of a site plan. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical detail. I'm not trying to teach surveyors how to put site plans together in this video. So a site plan is just it's a map, it's a document that shows two things. It shows existing conditions, so what's there right now on the parcel, and then it shows what are you proposing. Sometimes those can be on different sheets. Sometimes that information is laid on top of each other, so the proposed improvements go on top of the existing site conditions. But that's basically it. That's basically what a site plan shows. So I want to give you a couple examples, and we'll talk about them. We'll revisit these examples as we go through the video. So example one, you're going to build a barn on an existing agricultural parcel. So let's say you're in eastern San Joaquin County and you've got a big parcel. Let's say it's 100 acres. You've got some vineyards and maybe some orchards, and you need a barn. You need a pole barn or a shop. So you want to put that structure, let's say it's 20 by 40 or it's 30 by 50. You're going to put a big barn structure on your parcel, and you're going to plunk it down in the middle of the parcel. You need a place to park tractors and other farm equipment, and places where you can store stuff, keep it out of the weather. Okay, so that's one example. Second example is you've got an urban lot. Maybe there's a single family home on it right now. The zoning's changed, so you're going to tear down, you're going to demolish that older single family home, and you're going to put on an apartment building. Okay, so in both those situations, both those examples, you're going to need a site plan. Okay, so you're going to have to get a building permit more than likely for your barn or your shop, and you're definitely going to have to get a building permit for your apartment. So in both of those cases, you're going to have to prepare a site plan as part of the initial planning process, and that's usually when you need them. So a site plan isn't a full set of design plans. Okay, so it's not something that our architect or civil engineer has put together as a full set of plans to guide construction. It's generally something simpler than that. It's an early stage product where you're just trying to go in and see if you're going to be able to get some approvals from the agency before you actually pay to prepare a set of plans. Surveys are expensive, but architectural and engineering plans are expensive too. So a site plan is it's an intermediate step that allows you to get some feedback from a public agency before you go spend all the money on a full set of design plans. Now, in some agencies, they won't do that. They say, hey, you got to bring us in a full set of design plans before we're going to talk to you. But most places, especially here in the Central Valley, will take a site plan as an intermediary step. So in both those examples I gave you, the one with the barn and the one with the apartment building, you're going to prepare a site plan early on in the process. Okay, so when do you need a site plan? We talked about it a little bit. That's the second question we want to answer in this video. You need a site plan typically when you're going to a public agency, a local government agency to get approval for a project. So that could be you need a zoning variance, you need a rezone, you're going to do a land subdivision, you're going to do a lot line adjustment, you just need a building permit. Typically, in all of those situations, the agency is going to want to see some kind of site plan. They're going to want to see what's on the ground right now and what are you proposing, right? And that helps them understand how they need to apply the local rules to your project. So the other reason you might do a site plan, and this has nothing to do with what the local agency requires, is you might prepare a site plan when you're in some initial planning phases and you're just trying to decide if you've got a profitable project. So you want to know, what can I do with my land? And are those alternative development scenarios for my piece of parcel, are any of those profitable? And what's the level of profit risk? So the phrase that I use to describe that is, does the project pencil? Do the project financials pencil? Do the project financials pencil out? In other words, can you make money on your project, right? And so, and even if you're not going to sell, let's say you're going to keep, it's your farm and you just need the barn. Well, you still want to get an idea of what's it going to cost, right? What's the planning going to cost? What's the design going to cost? What's the construction want to cost? You don't want to start that process and spend that money unless you can finish it, right? And you may need to get a loan. And in either of those cases, you need to know how much is this going to cost. So even if you're not thinking about selling your parcel, you want to get an idea of cost. So one of the things that we help clients with before they even go see somebody at a government agency is we'll put together some rough design sketches, take a look at the zoning. We might evaluate a couple alternatives. And typically we're doing that with a site plan. That's part of how we communicate those different design alternatives to the client. So in either of those two situations, you might need a site plan. So you're going to get some kind of local government approval, or you're just trying to do some planning and some cost analysis on a real estate project of some kind. Okay, so when does a site plan need to be based on a survey? That's what we want to know. And for the most part, I'm talking about when does a site plan need to be based on a good, accurate boundary survey, although you may need some topographic surveying too, depending on what you're trying to do on a site plan. So I've got a 3-factor test I'm going to give you. This is a simple test that you can do yourself to decide, hey, somebody's going to prepare me a site plan. Do they need to have a survey? Should a surveyor be involved? So here's the 3-factor test. Factor number 1, are you going to use the site plan to consider project profitability? In other words, you're going to look at are you going to think about money? And if you are there what I call tipping points? And a tipping point means some criteria of the site that's could potentially make your project not profitable or make it not pencil. And I'm not going to get into detail on that in this video. I'll do another video about that, but I'll give you a quick example. If you're doing a subdivision and you're pretty close to a minimum acreage requirement, and that could mean the difference between having 4 parcels or 3 parcels. Okay, on most projects that size, a minor subdivision, we call it, you lose a lot, you lose 1 lot, so you go from 4 lots to 3, that could mean your project doesn't pencil. And so if you're close to what I call a tipping point like that, so minimum area is an example of a potential tipping point, then you want to get a survey as part of your site plan, because you don't want to be working with ballpark acreages if you're close to the minimum area. There's other tipping points. That's just one example. So that's the first question. Are you going to use a site plan to figure out if your project pencils financially, and if you are you close to any tipping points? And I'll teach you more about those tipping points. If you answer yes to those 2 questions, your site plan needs to be based on a survey. Factor number 2, this is the second factor in our 3-factor test. Are you placing a structure or other expensive improvements against a property line or a building setback? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, you need to base your site plan on a survey. You don't want to get into the situation that I talked about in the beginning where you've got some kind of building permit or other approval and you find out that you can't get your improvements on the site because there's not enough room, or you're violating a setback potentially. So if you're placing a building, another structure, or an expensive improvement, so what's an example of an expensive improvement? Let's say you've got an engineered retaining wall, right? Those can be really expensive. They can be more expensive than some buildings. If you've got that and you're putting it on a property line or up against a building setback, you want to make sure that your site plan is based on a survey. Here's the 3rd test. Are you on a compact urban lot? If you're on a compact urban lot, you need a site survey. You need a survey as part of your site plan, almost certainly. Okay, so let's go back to the two examples I gave you in the beginning. So we had the example of the guy that's putting on a barn in the middle of a 100-acre ag parcel. He probably doesn't need a survey. He's not on a compact urban lot, and I don't want to sell him a survey. That barn's not going to be anywhere near the property line. And what I will often tell people in that situation is, hey, go back to the planning department if they're asking you for a site plan that's based on a survey, and tell them you talk to a surveyor, you're in the middle of a large parcel, and you don't need to spend the money on the survey. You're nowhere near a property line. And a lot of times the planning department will be reasonable, and they'll say, yeah, you're right. You don't need a survey. But go to that second example where somebody's going to tear down a single family home on an urban lot and put on an apartment building. That's a pretty expensive improvement. It's going to be taking up a large portion of that lot. More than likely, you're going to be pushing up against setbacks or property lines. You need to get a survey. You're on a compact urban lot. Okay, so the last question that I wanted to answer in this video is, what can an unlicensed planner or a civil engineer or an architect, somebody that's not a licensed surveyor, what can they do and what can they not do on a site plan? Because if you've hired somebody to do a site plan and they're doing stuff they shouldn't be, it's going to cause you problems, and it also could be illegal. So here's 3 things your consultant should not be doing on a site plan if they're not a licensed surveyor. Number 1, they shouldn't show ties, dimensions, physical measurements from existing parcel boundaries to existing site features. So if your consultant shows a dimension from a property line to an existing building, or a property line to a well, or a property line to a septic tank, he needs to be a land surveyor. Okay, so people that aren't licensed land surveyors should not be tying an existing property line down to a physical feature on your site. You can't do that without a survey. And if the planning department or the building department is asking for that information, that means it needs to be accurate and you need a survey. Okay, so that's the first thing they should not do if they're not surveyors. If they're not surveyors, they shouldn't be verifying those type of tipping points that we talked about. So I'll just give you a quick list. If they're verifying that you meet minimum area requirements, that you don't exceed maximum area requirements, that you meet lot depth requirements or lot width requirements or street frontage requirements, or that you meet building versus lot size, floor area ratio requirements, any of those are tipping points. If you are not a licensed surveyor, you should not be telling your client based on a site plan without a survey that they meet any of those requirements if they're a tipping point, because you could cause your client serious problems later on in the process. So the last thing that a consultant shouldn't be doing on a site plan if they're not licensed is they shouldn't be locating existing parcel boundaries, easement boundaries, lease boundaries, or land use regulation boundaries. Okay? Any of those things. They shouldn't be telling you where the flood zone is at on your property. They shouldn't be telling you where that cell phone tower lease boundary is at. They shouldn't be telling you where that access easement is at if they're not a land surveyor. Okay? Because it can cause major problems. So remember, ask yourself this question. If you're getting a site plan prepared and it needs to show a property boundary or an easement or an existing lease, ask yourself this question. How is that consultant placing that boundary on the site plan in relation to other physical features? I don't know how you do that if you're not a land surveyor. Okay? You need to be a licensed land surveyor if you're going to do that. So, to sum this up, when does a site plan need a land surveyor? You need a site plan from a land surveyor if you're on a compact urban lot, if you're placing valuable improvements against a setback or against a property line. You need to map things like leases or easements, right? Or you're close to a tipping point, like a minimum area tipping point. In any of those 4 scenarios, you need to get a site plan that's based on a land survey. When do you not need a land survey for a site plan? Look, if you're putting a barn in the middle of a 100-acre farm, you probably don't need a survey for your site plan, right? If you're not sure, call a good land surveyor and ask them. Call Redefined Horizons, send us an email. We'll tell you, hey, we think you need a survey for this site plan, or hey, we don't think it's going to be required. Don't waste your money.